Hello everyone and welcome back to Real History. I'm your host, History Professor Jared Frederick, and I'm pleased in this segment to be once again revisiting Apple TV Plus's Masters of the Air. In our previous episode, we left off with a little bit of a cliffhanger as the 100th Bomb Group was on the eve of participating in the Normandy invasion, which I suspect will be a seminal moment in this forthcoming episode. We will also be returning to an extent the Mediterranean theater of operations as a new subplot of the series, that of the Tuskegee Airmen, is introduced here as well. So I'm looking forward to revisiting all of that and much more. Let's go ahead and start taking a look at the next installment of Masters of the Air.
I'd log that as a direct hit.
By this point in the war, the Tuskegee Airmen of the 99th Fighter Squadron had been in combat for nearly a year. They had arrived in North Africa about 5 months after Operation Torch and later moved to Italy. And there they engaged in tactical missions like the strafing and bombing runs shown here, and less frequently, though very effectively, on bomber escort missions. The plane that they're shown flying here, by the way, is the P-40 Warhawk, and this was a dependable fighter that was heavily produced during the war. I believe the third largest produced American aircraft during the war, but it lacked the sort of maneuverability of several of its German counterparts, and that, of course, was something that Tuskegee Airmen complained about until they finally received new planes.
Don't get me wrong, Captain. I'm extremely proud of what we've accomplished, but when are we going to get into some heavier action?
Ramitelli is located on the east coast of Italy, and the base there has likewise been portrayed in the HBO drama The Tuskegee Airmen, which was a childhood favorite of mine when I was growing up, as well as the movie Red Tails, which is often not held in as high regard. But in any case, this place was part of the Foggia Airfield Complex, and it was in operation for about a year and a half through the fall of 1945. And a sad thing, when I visit World War II battlefields or World War II landmarks in Italy, I notice a really sort of sad ambivalence when it comes to the preservation of such landmarks. And at Ramitelli, pretty much the only thing that remains is the dilapidated group operations building, which I think is the structure being shown here in the background. By contrast, the museum dedicated to the 100th Bomb Group at Thorpe Abbotts in England is very nice and very accessible. So I really hope that someday the Ramitelli building might likewise be saved, but those are often few and far between in Italy.
500 Tuskegee missions under our belt. That's reason to celebrate, Lieutenant.
Captain, sir.
But let's introduce Lieutenant Alexander Jefferson here. Jefferson hailed from Detroit. He went to college in Atlanta, and then he went on to grad school at Howard University in Washington, D.C., and there he studied chemistry. So really sharp guy, very scientific and technically minded. He enlisted in 1942, and he clearly had to clear a lot of hurdles in order to get a coveted spot at Tuskegee, and there he received his wings in January of 1944, so not too long before the scenes depicted here. And after some additional stateside training, he eventually winds up in Italy with the 301st Fighter Squadron, and man, does this guy have a long journey ahead of him.
Our job was to bomb the German defenses in Normandy only minutes before the landing craft hit the beaches, and then spend the day hitting German bridges, railroads, and communication lines further inland. About 200 missions in total.
Just 2 weeks before D-Day, the 100th Bomb Group lost another 9 planes during a mission to Berlin. And so that conveyor belt was not going to stop. The attrition rate often continues still. And as we consider the list of missions that the bomb group conducted in the days leading up to D-Day, I think they're worthy of mention here. Let's see. June 2nd, 1944, Boulogne shore defenses. Also on June 2nd, a railway junction near Paris. June 4th, Boulogne shore defenses yet again. June 5th, Abbeville, which had some very fierce anti-aircraft batteries located at it, as well as Boulogne once again. And on that June 5th mission, they lost 2 additional aircraft with 2 whole crews. So what Crosby speaks to here is right on the mark, and this is what he has to say about it in his memoir. We were to fly not 1 mission on D-Day -2, D-Day -1, D-Day, and the next day pluses as long as we could endure, but 5 to 10 missions a day. Our planes were to be briefed, take off, cover the sky in huge waves of bombers, drop their bombs, land, be debriefed and briefed, and take off again. Each Air Force, each division, each wing, each group, each squadron had a patch in the sky over Normandy, which it was to patrol. We had promised the GIs headed for Omaha Beach and all those other cauldrons that every plane they saw would be ours. On the maps, the sky was marked in colors, and we had a part in the spectrum. A great language that he uses here. During the week before D-Day, I worked 24 hours a day. I had to superintend the preparation of maps and flight plans. I had yet to set up the formations for over 100 different missions and variations. I had to brief all our navigators as a group and each lead navigator as an individual. I was a minute part in the whole operation, but I worked for 75 hours without even seeing my bed. I didn't shave. My orderly brought me a change of uniforms. I don't remember eating. I remember gallons of coffee, each cup so hot and strong, it shocked me into wakefulness. So this guy is burning it out at both ends. Wow.
32 hours. The second afternoon on the second day. But some coffee is no longer enough.
You need to sleep, Crosby.
Yeah. When the mission's over.
I take more pills.
Stimulants were available to airmen in one form or another. And my good friend and World War II veteran pilot, John Homan, who I co-authored Into the Cold Blue with, had this to say on this issue. Among the PEP pills included in our emergency packages, but presumably in some cases was also available on bases, was Benzedrine, a central nervous stimulant now known as amphetamine. This performance-enhancing drug was accessible to servicemen on both sides years before its addictive qualities were widely understood by physicians. At least one of my crewmen abused the substance to combat post-traumatic stress, then known as battle fatigue. Many more self-medicated with hard liquor because men were conditioned not to express their troubled feelings to others. So, whatever it took, I suppose.
You have to go to sleep.
No, I'm fine. I just gotta break.
Go to bed, Cross. That's an order. Now.
I can't do it, Jack.
Crosby!
I'm fine. Truly. Just a couple more things. I gotta get going.
A version of this does in fact happen, and this is what Crosby has to say on the matter. The night before D-Day, I was a zombie. Cross, go to your quarters and get some sleep, one of the officers said. Sir, there is still too much to do. I know that your department is in good shape. The job is done, but so are you. Go to bed. That's an order. Yes, sir. On the way to my quarters, I almost ran my Jeep into a tree. I was so nearly out. I fell onto my bed without even loosening my tie or removing my shoes. 74 hours later, I awakened, and it was all over.
If the station on full lockdown, sound of a couple thousand ships forming up weren't your first clues, we're a few hours away from the invasion of Europe.
A lot of airmen said that there was almost this electric sensation in the air the day before and morning of D-Day. And some say they could feel it in their bones, like somebody with arthritis can sense an impending rainstorm. And that's how one of them phrased it in a newspaper interview. And for my friend John Homan, he knew the invasion was near because all the men on his base were ordered to wear their sidearms around the clock. Words can't stress how big a moment this was. Everybody knew that D-Day was coming, but they didn't know exactly when or where. And that was where the great suspense ultimately was. Now, in my book, Dispatches of D-Day, A People's History of the Normandy Invasion, I go back to the period newspapers to find out how people were preparing for and reacting to this big invasion news, which was the biggest news story of the 20th century, at least for people in America and Western Europe. But here we are also introduced to the next CO in this revolving door of commanders for the 100th Bomb Group. And that is Thomas S. Jeffrey. And this guy is perfectly cast, by the way. He is the spitting image, just perfect casting as far as that's concerned. Spot on. Jeffrey was actually a graduate of the Virginia Military Institute. Prior to this, he had been air exec of the 390th Squadron, and by all accounts, he was a really soft-spoken sort of guy, very laid back, kind of a 180 of the likes of Chick Harding, who was very go-get-em and had that sort of attitude. This man was very reserved, and Crosby lovingly referred to him as Colonel Jeff. And so if you're reading Crosby's book, A Wing and a Prayer, when you read about Colonel Jeff, you are reading about Colonel Jeffrey. However, he arrived as the new CO about a month before D-Day and not on the eve of D-Day, as shown here, but forgivable condensing, I suppose.
Looks like the crowd's got some bad news. They landed, didn't they?
How you think? We're in Western Europe.
There could be these subtle hints about happenings in the broader world, the actions of German guards, the proximity and frequency of air raids, the influx of prisoners, and of course anything that could be interpreted over the homemade radios that they might have had in camp. And in at least one or two instances in other camps that I've read about, prisoners actually received food items shipped from home that were wrapped in newspapers. And of course, within those newspapers was news about the war. And apparently this was something that the Germans had overlooked and not taken into consideration. They just merely saw it as stuffing in a box. And so for a lucky few Allied prisoners, that is how they could get some information regarding these happenings in the outside world.
Evening, Captain. From Davis to Munich.
Now, you know I can't toast any mission with the loss of even a few bombs.
And here we have Benjamin O. Davis Jr. This guy was incredible. He was the first black West Point graduate of the 20th century. There had not been another black graduate from West Point in over 40 years prior to his graduation. The son of the first black general in U.S. Army history, his dad, who bears the same name. He later retires as a lieutenant general, later gets an honorary 4th star added to his shoulders in retirement. In 1998, this guy has an incredible record that spans the decades. And you may remember from the movie The Tuskegee Airmen, he is performed by the late, great Andre Braugher, which is a really good performance as well.
There's no time! Damn it! Pants! Pants! Where the hell are my pants? Come on, goddammit!
7:30 Saturday morning, Crosby.
Huh?
You've been out of it for 3 days.
As far as Crosby could recall, it wasn't 3 days that he was out, but 1. And this is what he later writes. 24 hours later, I awakened, and it was all over. On my radio, I heard BBC announcing that, quote, Allied armies have landed in France in the Havre-Cherbourg area. Axis Sally also was on the air. The center of gravity of the attack is Caen, the reports indicated. That's one of the places we bombed, I thought out loud. We fooled her. General Eisenhower came in then. We can now assure you all that France will soon again be under the command of the French. Then, more soberly, from President Roosevelt. Yes, we have made the first move on the new front, but victory still lies some distance ahead. It will be tough, and it will be costly. Group Ops, an assistant group navigator, had decided they didn't need me. The missions went off perfectly. My lead and command navigators performed like the heroic professionals they were, and I missed it all. Aww.
You've never seen anything like it. Hundreds of ships, thousands of men. For the 3rd time that day, we hit bridges, rail yards, communication centers. And the best part? There wasn't a single Luftwaffe fighter in the air. The skies were ours.
This is a wonderful bird's eye depiction of the Normandy beachhead. And this commentary by Rosenthal is something that really resonates with me because it mirrors what a lot of Allied airmen were writing and saying on D-Day. That partway through the day, the sun started to break through the clouds and it unveils this incredible vista of almost biblical scale. And for a lot of these men looking down on this massive humanity was almost akin to a religious experience. There's really no other way to put it. So I really enjoy this commentary, this meditation on Rosenthal's part. But something else that they were grateful of, too, that Rosenthal likewise mentions here, is the absence of the Luftwaffe. And this, in part, highlights what these men had been doing for over the previous year. Their commanders, Dwight Eisenhower among them, realized that the Normandy invasion could not take place until the Luftwaffe was destroyed, as well as its bases and the centers of industry that mobilized the Luftwaffe. And here on D-Day, it was apparent that all of their work, to a large extent, had been worthwhile. That wasn't to say that some of their costs hadn't been in vain, and that there hadn't been heedless or reckless loss of life. But on the whole, when you consider the success of D-Day, their sacrifices by and large had been worth it. And this is something that I think that we should think about, especially in the perspective of Hap Arnold, chief of the Army Air Forces. And this is what he had to say of this situation at this point in the war. The Luftwaffe, he said, will have to scrape the bottom of the barrel, and they won't get much after that but splinters in their fingers. Our barrel, though we may have to dig deeper in it, still has much left. The war of attrition proceeded at a staggering pace. Once again, that is from my D-Day book, and it really speaks to the sort of strategic mentality that is being embraced in this point of the war, and that is, in many cases, quantity over quality. That we're going to pull this off by sheer force of will and numbers, and the lack of German opportunity to replace what has been lost. This is in no small part how the war in Western Europe is going to be won. One thing that viewers may consider to be a little bit strange is why D-Day is not depicted more in depth. After all, you have all these missions. I'm looking at their mission list here. On D-Day, they actually bombed Weestrom, the attack of which is depicted in the 1962 movie The Longest Day. They bombed the town of Falaise twice, as well as a number of other targets, and you may be wondering, this is the most perhaps consequential day of the war in Western Europe. Why isn't it getting a little bit more screen time? And I suppose the best way I can answer that is, well, our main character, the narrator, Harry Crosby, is asleep during all of this, and so it's kind of immersive to the extent that we miss the Normandy invasion much like he does. And so I think it's a rather interesting creative choice that's rather daring in and of its own right. And I think that the filmmakers presume that we know what D-Day is all about, and we can connect the dots accordingly.
We need to start preparing now. Conserving rations, getting them in shape. Everything we do from this point on needs to be to prepare for all three scenarios: mass execution, forced march, or pitched battle.
By mid-August, the Allies had recaptured Paris, and, well, many a foot soldier and generals as well are starting to develop, well, a rather overly optimistic ambition that the war very well may in fact be over by Christmas. And you can only imagine the mixed emotions of these men within the camp. Each passing day meant that you're either on the eve of liberation or mass execution. That is quite the roller coaster of psychology. And as one goes stir-crazy in a Stalag, it's a completely natural impulse to plan to fight back if you have the strength to do so. Something else that these men did, as we see in the likes of The Great Escape, they try to make like forgery passes. If you can get a legit one, if you can rig up a rudimentary printing press, if you can smuggle supplies accordingly, you may be able to, pass off as somebody living in the Reich. But those were going to be few and far between.
Operation Dragoon takes place in 3 days. Your mission is what makes it possible. Marseille, Saint-Tropez, Toulon.
I'm glad to see Operation Dragoon, also known as Operation Anvil, get some love here. It truly is one of the great and understudied campaigns of the Second World War, primarily because it's wedged between these two equally large yet better known operations, Operation Overlord on one end, Operation Market Garden on the other. But in short, this undertaking was devised as a means to supplement the Normandy invasion by forcing the Germans to divert men and resources to southern France, as it was likewise invaded. So it's like this major pincer move, and the noose continues to tighten around the Third Reich's domain in consequence. And this involved over 500,000 Allied personnel, so this is nothing to shrug off. This is a major undertaking in and of its own right, and accordingly, it's something it's worth remembering. I mean, I'm glad it's being acknowledged here.
If we kick the tanks after the run, That'll drop us a couple £1,000, but we'll still fall hundreds of miles short, sir.
The reason that Richard Bacon is so precise and so good at these mathematical calculations is because he actually had a degree in math, which he obtained before he enlisted into the Army Air Forces in 1942. This guy has a hell of a story ahead of him, and we're going to get into it here in a little bit. I'll also add that this briefing room that is recreated here is spot on recreation of that space at Ramitelli, and we'll show you a photograph of a rather famous photo here to prove it. This is one of my favorite photos of the Tuskegee Airmen. I had it hanging in the hallway outside my office for a while until it got too faded. I need to get a new one of it for sure.
Westbrook, you gotta bail! 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 No, Gordon, get out! Bail! Bail!
There was a Tuskegee Airman by the name of Shelby Westbrook, but he lived until the year 2016, and it looks like his character dies here in this scene, so that's an interesting choice. But all that said, Lieutenant Joseph E. Gordon did perish on this mission, and he passes away age 21 when a piece of German flak strikes his plane. You can visit his grave at the Epinal American Cemetery and Memorial in France, and in fact, I have seen his grave myself when I visited that cemetery in 2019. Most of them don't get a lot of visitation. Most of the cemeteries I go to when I visit overseas, 9 times out of 10, it seems like I and my friends and family, we have the place to ourselves. If you ever have the chance to visit such a burial ground, I definitely encourage you to do so, because they are incredibly profound, scenic, yet tragic places to contemplate on the human cost of war. And Joseph Gordon was among them.
Why do you fight for a country who treats you like that?
Do you know any other country that's better? I know what my country's shortcomings are. And I know it's trying hard to become what it says it's supposed to be.
Oh, wow, this is a wonderfully performed scene, and I think it well expresses how many black troops felt during the war, that they were fighting for that right, that ability to prove that they were worthy of the title of being called an American. Still, one could make the argument that life could be a little bit better in places like the United Kingdom, which lacked as formal a color line in contrast to many regions in the United States. I mean, in Britain, black soldiers could date white women, and they generally weren't barred from establishments like restaurants and clubs unless the military deemed so. And so, sad point of the matter is that this sort of disparity between often how they were treated in England and back home led to more than a few race riots in the months leading up to D-Day. But the part about Macon hoping that his service could help make America a better place is a very real sentiment, in my view. If you look at newspapers such as the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender, these publications initiated very public campaigns during the war to promote that same sort of vision. And the fact that over 1 million black men and women served honorably in the segregated military during the war most definitely correlates with this post-war civil rights movement that's blossoming in the 1950s and the 1960s. There's definitely a connective tissue there. And while we're on that topic, it's also worth mentioning that this episode is directed by Dee Reese, who made a wonderful movie set in the 1940s that delves into some of these similar issues. That movie is entitled Mudbound. And if you haven't seen it, that is definitely one to put on your list.
I saved our asses so many times, I tell you what.
This line is obviously a tip of the hat to the effectiveness of the Tuskegee Airmen. Now, they didn't have a 100% perfect record as far as bomber protection goes, and is often suggested in previous movies and films, but they did an excellent job nonetheless. As Macon is being brought into camp here, I mean, his neck is fractured, his shoulder is broken. I cannot begin to fathom the level of excruciating pain that this guy is feeling. And so he's languishing here in camp, and it takes quite a while for his neck to finally be reset accordingly. And this is what Jefferson had to write about what his comrade Macon was going through. And this is from the book Red Tail Captured, Red Tail Free, which is Jefferson's book. Macon was in bad shape and appeared to have a fractured neck because every time he moved abruptly, he passed out. And we see dialogue acknowledging that. We braced his neck and head to make them immovable. When we got him up the next morning, he had to walk very slowly, trying not to move his head. So, I mean, this is, it must have been absolutely unbearable. It's almost hard to even contemplate. But something else that I'd like to point out here, the following appeared in the hometown newspaper, the Birmingham News in Alabama, regarding the capture of Richard Macon. And this is March 1945. This is so long after. It's over half a year between his capture and this being published, which is astounding in its own right. Prisoner of war. Lieutenant Richard D. Macon is a prisoner of war of Germany, according to word received by his wife, who is bookkeeper at Miles College in Birmingham. Lieutenant Macon, who entered the Army in March 1943, was serving as a pilot with the 15th Air Force in Italy at the time he was captured in August 1944. He has been overseas since July 1944, having received his wings and commission at Tuskegee Army Air Base in February 1944. In letters received by his wife, Lieutenant Macon praised the work of the Red Cross in his prison camp. He is a graduate of Miles College and a former teacher in Fayette, Alabama. His mother and father reside at 524 South 63rd Street, Fairfield. So a great little snapshot there attesting to the plight of this prisoner of war.
Yes, it's good.
Gentlemen, welcome to paradise.
To my knowledge, there's no evidence to suggest that captured men of the 100th interacted with any of the Tuskegee prisoners. I think this is all hypothetical to an extent. Yet these sorts of initial interactions likely did occur in some manner, or at least could have occurred in some manner. And something that comes to mind here as I was reading Frank Murphy's book, and Frank Murphy is lingering in the background here, and his character looks really uncomfortable and suspicious in this scene. Murphy grew up in segregated Atlanta, and in his memoir, he later writes of his childhood adulation of anything Confederate. And so you have to wonder, with these opposing worldviews, what sort of friction could this have led to? And simply put, like all of us, these guys were often products of their times, environments, and upbringings. And I'm not saying that in a critical way, I'm saying it in a way that encourages us to understand how people are thinking and reacting to each other. And in scenes like this, there is this unspoken tension, and I don't think it's necessarily inaccurate at all.
As I've explained 3 times to the last 3 people I've been put on with, I'm a friend. I've been calling for a couple of days now. Subaltern Westgate gave me this number to reach her.
Captain Westgate is not available, sir.
Captain?
This dialogue, too, is taken almost verbatim from the book, and in fact, I read that very reference, that very excerpt in our last episode. But let's dive a little bit deeper into the ever-mysterious background of Wingate, referred to as Westgate in the show. And here, too, Crosby has something to note of the matter. She knew better than I did what was happening on the continent. From her, I first came to realize the extent of the Holocaust. Jews in France are being systemically removed from Paris and Nice. They have disappeared from the villages, she noted. And so that's a good tie-in to some of the depictions of her actions that we see in this episode. Was she a spy? Was she dropped into France? The Low Countries, perhaps? Certainly her strange disappearances suggested that. Was she in intelligence? Certainly her knowledge of languages and strategy, concealed though it was, made that possible. I never knew, I never asked, she never told me. All I knew was that she was making my life much more endurable. I did not tell Jean about Landra. And so there's some secretive stuff going on here in more ways than one. So it's certainly in the realm of possibility that perhaps Landra was in the like of the SOE or some equivalent. And I'm sure perhaps in some London archives, perhaps still under closure today, that there are records about what she did or didn't do during the war years. But I tried to dig around in some UK newspapers about her background, and unfortunately it didn't yield many results. I found one article that suggests that she did in fact marry after the war. She may have lived in Scotland for a time as well, but I've largely come up with a question mark about Wingate, and we know very little about her other than what Crosby conveys in his book. And so she is a mystery still. And if you find any additional information on Wingate, we invite you to share your knowledge in the comments section below. It's fun to see Doctor Who in the series with an American accent, no less. But a lot like Landra, his character, Second Lieutenant Robert H. Daniels, poses a little bit of a mystery to me. Now, I'm not going to spoil his narrative for you, not yet, but his obituary states only some really vague information about his life and military career, though it does acknowledge the fact that he was shot down and captured in August 1944 and was subsequently a prisoner. But in any case, there's a lot more research that needs to be done on Daniels.
Why didn't you gripe about us bunking an 8?
Well, let's just say I at least knew you weren't spies.
Ain't that a bitch?
That's some good dialogue. And sure enough, when you're in the fight of your life, appearance and ancestry doesn't matter a damn. So in the background of the pub here, we see some Toby jugs, which are on display. Now, Of course, these were a common sight in pubs of both then and now, but I would very much like to think that this is a subtle nod to this Toby jug, a larger version of which is depicted quite famously in the Air Force's movie 12 O'Clock High. And this was sitting on the mantle of the officers' club in that movie, and played an important role as a rather cinematic, tangible device.
Excited to see Gene?
And what if it's not the same?
This scene underscores why Rosenthal has become my favorite character in the series, and that is because he goes through this wonderful and revealing character arc. He arrives as this rookie lieutenant who is eager to get advice, and now here, near the end of the series, he's the one giving out advice. And it really speaks to that sort of dynamic, that, once again, that evolving sense of leadership. And it also is a testament as to why Rosenthal became such a beloved figure, especially in the eyes of Harry Crosby. So I've gained a lot of admiration for this guy as I've been researching his life and watching the series.
Jesus Christ. The Russians crossed into Germany.
I would presume that he is making reference to the Prussian offensive of October 1944, which was this huge incursion into Germany, which involved over 2 million troops between both sides. And this is helpful because it demonstrates to the viewer that very big things are afoot. And these prisoners who are at Stalag Luft 3 and the like feel that they are very much trapped in the middle, that they are wedged between these two massive forces approaching from both east and west alike. And so once again, we are left off on something of a cliffhanger as the fate of these prisoners hangs in the balance. To conclude, I'd say this is a very interesting episode. I think that there are a lot of good dynamics amongst the characters that are rich in historical context. It offers us some different perspective. It allows us to reflect on the sort of interpersonal relationships. And something else that I think is very helpful as well is that we really get a sense of this multi-theater operation. I think a little bit of a glimpse of the Mediterranean, what's going on in Italy, what's happening in southern France, what's happening in northwestern France. We really get a sense of this fusion that was the year 1944 as far as military operations were concerned. And so much of the series has, I think, done very well at looking at the micro, at how a bomb group operates. And I think this episode presents us some perspective on the macro. It gives us kind of a bigger picture. And I think all in all, that is something really helpful in our considerations of the air war over Europe. That covers everything for this episode of Real History. We are eager to hear your thoughts. What were your thoughts and opinions on this episode of Masters of the Air? And if you haven't done so already, please make sure that you hit that subscribe button below. We invite you to check out our website as well as that of the 100th Bomb Group Foundation, where you can find additional information and resources on these heroic individuals. We appreciate you tuning in, and until we see you next time on Real History, stay curious.